Developers are really important when it comes to emerging technologies, of which crypto is one. And we have some fresh numbers as part of CoinDesk's Biddle Week that suggests that developer activity is not slowing down. Despite this historic bear market, the devs are still sticking around, committing code to open source repositories on GitHub, and that's what we're tracking here. We're looking at something like 6,000 to 7,000 weekly active developers since the start of 2023, according to some data compiled by Artemis.xyz. Let's talk about what it means and why it matters. Will, let's talk about the devs. Why does everyone always want to hang out with the devs? Why are they so important? What does it mean?
Okay, but let's be fair. They only care about the devs during the bear market. This is like the classic storyline, right? During the bull market, with these nice big checks, all we talk about is headlines. I mean, I don't think there was a day last year during the hash where we didn't talk about some big new funding round from some company, right? And now all that money is going to these developers' pockets, and they're coding away on GitHub. And, you know, that's a good thing. We're celebrating them. To me, that doesn't really tell much of a story, though. Yes, people are coding more, but it's really because we're seeing that capital go to work finally, right? So we see that actual implementations of commits to GitHub are going up, continuing up, and they're not really dropping along the bear market. I think a lot of people thought like this might be cyclical, right? Where a lot of people drop off, a lot of people get laid off. But in reality, like a lot of these checks were written for the purpose of building new projects. And that means coding at the end of the day. That doesn't mean marketing. That doesn't mean legal. That means coding, right? So that's where all that money is going. One sort of like sidetrack I want to bring up here is actually Bitcoin maintainers and Bitcoin coders compared to the rest of everyone in crypto. All these other crypto projects, they have a lot of funding mechanisms set up, right? Where you can go to VCs, you can do token allocation, you can do some sort of funding round. That's all there. And that's why you see like a lot of coders building on these other projects. Bitcoin, on the other hand, doesn't really have that, right? Like you often get donations from individual companies. Maybe someone has a stash of Bitcoin that they're able to just live off of and then can continue to commits to Bitcoin. But if you look at like the number of people who are working in Bitcoin, it's actually dwindling. We had a maintainer, a longtime maintainer, step down this last week. So there was only 5 maintainers previously for the Bitcoin core implementation, and now there's only 4. It doesn't mean there's only 4 coders working on Bitcoin this time. There's only 4 maintainers, which are basically like combing through, looking for bugs. There's still a lot of people working on the Bitcoin core software, but it's pretty tiny compared to that graphic we just saw. You know, there's thousands of other coders working on thousands of Web3 products. There's not a lot of people working on Bitcoin right now because the funding isn't really there. Jen, I'll throw it over to you for your take.
Yeah, you kind of said a little bit at the top of your answer there. Amongst all of these layoffs, I think this data shows us that developers aren't the ones losing jobs, right? They're still developing. They're still out here. From what I've seen in the industry, and I don't have a lot of numbers or deep research to back this up, developers are not only not losing jobs, but a lot of firms are still hiring for developers in the space. They're still doing pretty okay when we look at some of the other jobs that people can have in this industry. There are still grant programs that are targeting developers. There is still investment being made to developers who have novel ideas. And so I think that this is just great news for the industry and open source, right? The whole ethos of this industry is we're tearing down walled gardens. To see all these commits on GitHub show that developers are still committed to that. This is still open source. We are still heading towards a future where we can build together, and it's cool. Zach?
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out for me is, you see these massive drawdowns in price when it comes to like crypto cyclicality. You don't really see that with the developer numbers, right? Like those developers, like it's a sticky experience. They don't tend to leave when the price sheds something like 80% in value on some networks, right? So the fact that I think developers are sticking around despite the cyclicality that you mentioned, Will, like is a genuinely interesting finding. And, given that these smart contract blockchains are still fairly new in terms of how much sort of historical data we have, that this is sort of an emerging consensus that we're seeing. These developers tend to stick around once they start dabbling in Web3 software development. That I think is something that the industry, should feel heartened by, honestly, that price and developer activity aren't super correlated. I think it was last month, January, was the Electric Capital Developer Report. That said something that like 23,000 monthly active developers work on these prominent smart contract blockchains, of which Ethereum is top dog, by the way, we should say. So there is, people that are doing this stuff. relative to the entirety of sort of like Web 2 coding land, it's still super small. And we should definitely, be pretty upfront about that. 23,000 monthly active developers on the open source side. Sure, that may be undercounting it because there's people building in closed source within teams. Still, let's say, 30,000 crypto developers. That's tiny relative to the rest of the development, like population. So it is worth pointing that out, that even though it's growing, it's still probably pretty small sliver of the total pie. But Will, I'll toss it to you. Sorry, your hand.
I love the Easter egg with the electric capital report, the Wellstein report everyone looks forward to every year. Nice little call out there. One thing I want to bring up is like the AI angle here that everyone's talking about right now, right? Like there's about 30,000 developers in crypto, plus or minus. We'll take that number, Zach, from you. What happens though when we see like AI jump into these things? I think a lot of people are questioning that. Like, I think it's a little overhyped personally, but you can talk about it, right? So like, where are these things going to go? We saw a lot of drawdowns in different sectors, like Coinbase has had a lot of layoffs. Meta this morning, just for like another layoff tangential story here, is going to do more layoffs. What's going to happen when we see like the implementation of broader tech efficiency gains like AI? And I got to throw it to Jen. I feel like you have a hot take on this, or at least I hope you do. Crossing my fingers.
I don't have a hot take on it. I'm so sorry. I will give my very mediocre, lukewarm take that kind of has nothing to do with what you said. And then maybe Zach will have a hot take on it. The article compared these developer numbers to developer numbers in 2020. And my very boring take now, Will, I hate that you set me up for this, is that I think this is like also indicative of all of these mainstream brands that you mentioned, Will, are doing layoffs now. They're really committed to the space. Despite the market, despite the headlines, we still see them building. Every day we have this like road to boring story still continuing throughout the bear market. I think there was some Tencent and Microsoft news that came out this morning. And so this is just good news. That's my boring take. Will, do you have something hotter to say?
I'll snatch it one more time. I'll snatch it. I want to set up Zach for a question I actually have for him. There's a lot of these layer ones and layer two projects that got a ton of money during the last 2 years and they don't know how to spend it. And now they're going to spend on developers next few years. And during the previous cycle, we saw EOS and a bunch of these other firms just kind of blow out because they had a lot of money, but they didn't go anywhere with it. They had no product market fit. Zach, do you think the same thing happens this time around with a lot of layer ones, layer twos that have so much money? They might have developers working on stuff, but at the end of the day, no one cares about their products. And if so, name some tokens, sir. I want to hear some projects.
Wow. I don't know what you're. I kind of get where you're going with this one. Will's trying to stir it up today. That's fantastic. I think the thing that stood out to me actually from the Electric Capital report that's not mentioned here is the emergence of the multi-chain developer, right? Where you can be like an EVM developer and you can deploy your stuff across various networks, right? So I think that is actually empowering at the developer level and may sort of change the calculus relative to them having to lock their fortunes to one particular chain, right? Say I do EVM and I can deploy on Arbitrum and then I can do on Optimism and I can go wherever it suits me, right? And I think that does kind of change that dynamic where there's a bit more sort of like flexibility, especially within the EVM universe, that maybe didn't exist in the past cycle relative to those other L1s. But hey, who knows? Jen, I think formulated
very political.
I didn't know. It's not. Hey. Stop setting me up for this hot take. It's not that hot. I think that this shows also like developers have a lot to work on, right? In the last bull cycle, we had a lot of issues, a lot of hacks, a lot of security issues, and so I think that those were highlighted, and it's important that we work on them to have a better industry.